Então, acho que, Lucas, acho que pode abrir a transmissão. Vou mudar para inglês agora. Vou falar, vou ser muito breve, só algumas palavras introdutórias.
A
E,
gente já estamos no ar.
perfeito. So, good evening to all that's seen us today and this grand final of the 11th Rio Pre-Moot. It is always a pleasure conducting this the organization of the Rio Pre-Moot this year in a new format. We had the in-person rounds on the Saturday, the virtual rounds on Sunday, and today we would have the winner of the in-person rounds facing with the winner of the virtual rounds. Fortunately for the team that won, but unfortunately for the organization, that was the very same team, the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, that is then considered the winner of the Rio Pre-Moot. However, what we will have here today is a match for the second place of the Rio Pre-Moot between the runner-up of the in-person edition, the Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, and the runner-up for the virtual edition, Centro Pessoense, UNIP. So, UNIP will be claimant in this hearing, and Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina will be respondent. So, just to introduce the panel of this evening, we have Luisa Como, who is Deputy Secretary General at Kansas CBC, and is also a fellow of the Schroeder Institute of Arbitrators. We also have Lucas da Costa Mendes, who's also a fellow of the Schroeder Institute of Arbitrators, holds an LLM on the Queen Mary University of London, and is a partner at Laudelino Advogados. And last but definitely not least, Frederico Singarajá, barrister and arbitrator. So without further ado, I pass now the word to Frederico as presiding for this finals panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Many thanks to Bernard, many thanks to Joaquin and all the organizers of the Rio Pre-Moots. Many thanks also to my co-arbitrators, Louisa and Lucas, who are great colleagues and friends. And I'm sure that both teams are in for a fantastic panel. So without further ado, I understand that the parties have agreed that they will have 14 minutes for their main arguments with 1 minute rebuttal, and that the respondents will start arguing for the procedure, and the claimant will start their arguments for the merits. Is that correct? Yes, I'm getting nods. Okay. In that case, I will pass on to the respondents for procedure to begin. I've got your 40 minutes. I make the time now 9:05 in London, which I think is 6:05 p.m. in Rio. So whenever you're ready.
Honorable members of this tribunal, esteemed colleagues, good evening. My name is Julia Demarque, and I, together with my co-counsel, Isadora Scotlo, represent respondent in today's proceedings. I'll address the procedural issues, while my co-counsel will address the merits of the dispute. Members of this tribunal, we are here today because claimant tries to benefit from an excessively favorable contract, obtained most likely by corruption in the context of one of the largest corruption scandals in the history of Equatoriana. In order to achieve this goal, claimant tries to enforce an invalid arbitration agreement disregarding the Equatoriana's constitutional requirements and tries to escape the criminal court investigations conducted by the competent authorities of Equatoriana. In the course of my submissions, I shall demonstrate that first, the arbitral tribunal does not have jurisdiction to hear this case, as the arbitration agreement was never validly concluded. And second, that if the arbitral tribunal understands that it has jurisdiction, then the proceeding should be stayed until the investigations are concluded, and if the stay is not granted, then the proceeding should at least be bifurcated. Proceeding to my first submission, I shall now demonstrate that the arbitral tribunal does not have jurisdiction to hear this case, as the arbitration agreement was never validly concluded. Under Article 518 of the New York Convention, an arbitral award may not be recognized or enforced if the parties to the arbitration agreement were, under the law applicable to them under some incapacity. It is widely recognized that the law applicable to them, mentioned by Article 518, is the personal law of the party in question. In the present case, therefore, the law that determines respondent's capacity to arbitrate is the law of Equatoriana. According to Article 75 of Equatoriana's Constitution, a state-owned entity can only submit to foreign-seated arbitration in administrative contracts if there has been approval by the Parliament. In the present case, however, this approval by the Parliament was never granted, and the contract was only signed by the Minister for Natural Resources and Development. In Fujiwara's
Council, can I just ask you a question there? Let's say, for argument's sake, if we were with you on the non-signing or non-approval from Parliament, why is this an administrative contract for the purposes of this dispute?
Mr. President Arbitrator, this is an administrative contract, as it is a contract that relates to public services, and this is the widely accepted definition of an administrative contract, considering the fact that Equatoriana does not have a specific definition.
Sorry, what's your authority for it being a well-known definition?
This is recognized by international legal scholar Redfern and Hunter, and is also recognized by other judicial and arbitral awards. And also, in the present case, it shall be considered the fact that the parties never disputed that the present contract was an administrative contract.
Sorry, but just I don't think Alan Redfern or Martin Hunter were commenting on the law of Equatoriana, and your submission is that it's the law of Equatoriana that applies here. So is there any Equatorian authority to say that this is an administrative contract as opposed to international authority?
Yes, Mr. President Arbitrator, Redfern and Hunter did not cite the law of Equatoriana. However, in the present case, it was never disputed between the parties that the present purchase and supply agreement was an administrative contract, as has always been.
Sorry. So is your submission that there is an admission, there is common ground, it is not disputed that this is an administrative contract from the other side? The claimant doesn't dispute that. Is that your submission?
Mr. President Arbitrator, to better demonstrate this, if you may, in the arbitral tribunal, may accompany me to page 18 of the records, and please let me know when you get there.
Yeah, I'm there. Horatia Porter's witness statement.
Yes, is everyone with me? On paragraph 6, and the phrasing started with "at the same time," we can see that Ms. Horacia Porter, claimant's witness statement, states that my understanding was that the agreement as a contract for public infrastructure required an approval by the minister in charge, which was in this case the Minister for Natural Resources and Development. In addition, an approval by Parliament is required if such contracts contain an arbitration clause. It can be seen, therefore, that claimant has always been aware that the present contract, as an administrative contract, required this approval. However,
and is Ms. Horatia Porter qualified, an Equatorian lawyer?
Yes, as we can see in the first and on the second paragraph, pardon me, Ms. Horacia Porter has a degree in law and has worked since October 29, 2009 in the legal department of John I, and was therefore aware of this requirement and of the fact that parliamentary approval was never granted. As we can see on page 47 of the records, that while Mr. Bluntsley was aware that the debate in Parliament, that is, claimant COO, besides the legal counsel for claimant, he was aware that the debate in Parliament had been cancelled and there was no official consent from Parliament to the contract.
Sorry, where am I looking at? Page 46?
Page 47 on paragraph 30.
30, okay.
Yes, on line 6 of the same paragraph, in the phrase starting with, in the present case, we can see that with the receipt of the advance payment from respondent, claimant was no longer concerned about the issue of the lacking parliamentary consent and did not follow up on it despite the information received from Mr. Bluntsley that no formal consent had been granted.
So, Council, do you have any instructions as to why the payment was made if there was no parliamentary consent? Why was the contract performed by your client?
The contract was performed because it was believed that the parliamentary consent would be later granted. However, this never occurred, and the claimant has always been aware of this.
But Ms. Julia, just to understand, the parliamentary consent was necessary for the contract itself or for the arbitration clause?
It was necessary for the arbitration agreement to be considered valid. And this,
so the contract in itself was a valid contract. We're talking specifically about the approval of the parliament in regards to the arbitration clause.
Yes, Mr. Arbitrator, according to Article 75 of Equatoriana's Constitution, parliamentary approval is necessary in order for an arbitration agreement to be considered valid. And what we have here, therefore, is the fact that the claimant contracted with a state-owned entity, knew of its requirements, and now tries to force it to violate its own constitution in order to arbitrate in the present proceedings. This cannot be accepted.
Sorry, Council, just one question on what your submission there. You said that Article 75 says that parliamentary approval is required for the contract to be considered valid.
Yes.
That's slightly different to a capacity issue, isn't it? So does that mean that it's just the Ecuadorian government that they don't consider it valid? How does that translate into us not finding it to be valid?
Mr. Presiding Arbitrator,
Let me just clarify. Is there any distinction between a lack of capacity or an invalidity of the contract as far as we're concerned?
Mr. Presiding Arbitrator, the incapacity of a party leads to the invalidity of the present arbitration agreement. As the parties did not have capacity to submit the disputes to arbitration, and therefore there never was the conclusion of a valid arbitration agreement. However, if the arbitral tribunal understands that it has jurisdiction, then the proceedings should be stayed until the ongoing investigations against Mr. Field are concluded. And with that, I move on to my second submission. Members of this tribunal, the contract here discussed was obtained in the context of one of the largest corruption scandals in the history of Ecuadoriana. This scandal is directly associated with the award of suspicious contracts by Ecuadoriana's geoscience COO, Mr. Field. One of the contracts that are being investigated by those investigations is the present purchase and supply agreement. As
Council, are there any current convictions for corruption?
There is still no convictions for corruptions regarding the investigations conducted by the criminal courts. However, there is already proof to the payment of significant amounts by Ecuadoriana's geoscience COO to companies that were awarded by the tender process opened by Ecuadoriana's geoscience.
But no convictions per se.
No, there is still no convictions, especially considering the fact that these investigations are starting in the beginning of 2023. And considering that these investigations will directly affect the present proceedings, the arbitral tribunal should stay the proceedings in order to avoid rendering an incorrect decision that could later be affected by conflicting awards. Members of this tribunal, it first must be taken into account the fact there are significant reasons to believe that the present purchase and supply agreement was tainted by corruption. First, because it is undisputed between the parties that Ecuadoriana is amongst the 20% most corrupt countries in the world. Secondly,
Council, one issue. Wouldn't there always be a risk of there being different outcomes because we are a civil tribunal and the investigations are criminal, and so there may well be different standards of proof. So if there is that risk, why should we stay?
Yes, there is always must always be possibility of having conflicting decisions. However, this should not be allowed by this arbitral tribunal, considering the fact that there is already investigations related to the present purchase and supply agreement, and that these investigations that are being conducted can be used by the arbitral tribunal to render its award, especially considering the fact that the arbitral tribunal does not possess the broad investigative powers that are necessary to analyze the corruption claims.
But we don't need those powers, do we, counsel? We can just make a finding to the civil standard on the evidence before us.
Yes, and declare the contract to be void. Couldn't we?
Yes, Mr. Arbitrators, if I may answer the questions ensemble, the arbitral tribunal could find in a civil sphere if the contract was void or not. But we shall take into account in the present case the fact that there are significant reasons to believe that it was tainted by corruption. And if later the criminal courts of Equatoriana have a conflicting decision, there is significant possibility that the arbitral award will not be enforced, considering
Counsel.
Sorry. Yes.
If your submission is that there are significant reasons to believe that the contract is tainted by corruption, and you can say that to us today, then I'm struggling to understand your submission that we must wait for an investigation. If you're making a submission today, you're making a positive assertion that there are sufficient reasons that people are aware of now.
Mr. Presiding Arbitrator, these reasons shall be closely analyzed by the investigations in order to decide if there was indeed corruption, as it cannot be now investigated by the arbitral tribunal, especially considering the fact that this arbitral tribunal cannot analyze the witness statements that are the witness that are necessary to be heard, as it does not have the power to compel its production, nor have access to the documents that are necessary. Therefore, this
Counsel, just to let you know, your time is technically up.
Yes, Mr. Arbitrator, Mr. Presiding Arbitrator, if I may have one additional minute to finish my submissions and to conclude.
Any objection?
Nope.
Go ahead.
If the arbitral tribunal, however, understands that the state is not should not be applied, the arbitral tribunal should bifurcate the issues so that for now it should only analyze the issues provided by procedure order number 1, and on the second phase of the proceedings, it would analyze the validity of the contract. Members of this tribunal, bifurcation is an effective tool that can be used in order to render a more fact-grounded award. In the present case, as there is already investigations conducted by the criminal courts of Equatoriana, the evidence produced related to the corruption claims could be used on the second phase of the proceedings in order to analyze whether the contract is valid or not. This would amount to a significant reduction of the costs incurred by the parties and could therefore be granted. In conclusion, respect. Yes.
Thank you, counsel. Okay, as we're pushing on time, I'm going to cut you short, I'm afraid, and move on to the claimants' counsel on procedure. Over to you, claimants.
Thank you very much, Mr. Presiding Arbitrator, honorable members of the Subdued Tribunal, esteemed colleagues, good evening. My name is José Luis Londres, and I will address the procedural issues of this case on behalf of claimant, Drone I PLC. Before I turn to the procedural issues of this case, let me paint a different picture on today's proceedings. Respondent tries in this present proceedings to escape its contractual obligations made with claimant, relying only in the possibility of corruption with no concrete evidence or proof, choosing to put their personal interest in front of contractual liability. In light of those circumstances, my speech will be divided in 2 main points, addressed at the same order it was addressed by respondent, being the first, that in fact, the Subdued Tribunal has jurisdiction to hear the case, and second, that this proceeding shall not be suspended or bifurcated, but in fact, continued. Coming to my first point, before we discuss the jurisdiction of the Subdued Tribunal to the present case, it's important to take a step back and analyze the formulation of an arbitration agreement to the present case. Respondent alleges that relying on the requirements of Article 75 of Equatoriana's Constitution and to Article 51A of the New York Convention, there is no arbitration clause validly concluded between the parties.
Counsel, do you agree with your opponent's submission that it is we must look at the Equatoriana law to determine whether or not capacity is in play here?
Mr. Arbitrator, we do agree that the law of Equatoriana is applicable to the present case, but claimant does not submit that this is in fact an issue of capacity, but an issue of consent. Because respondent, even though it is a state-owned entity, they have its own autonomy to conclude contracts and arbitration clauses that must be approved by the Parliament as is present in Article 75 of Equatoriana's Constitution. However, the approval of the Parliament submitted by respondent in this present proceedings is not so important as they try to picture in the present case. And
sorry, Counsel, if the minister was not authorized by Parliament on behalf of the government of Equatoriana, then he didn't have capacity to bind the government of Equatoriana. So what's the distinction in your submission between consent and capacity on these facts?
Mr. Arbitrator, the minister had the capacity to negotiate the arbitration clause in the present case because he was the chair of the supervisory board of the NP development program and the representation of the state in the contracts concluded by Equatoriana Geoscience. And in the present case, the minister informed claimant that the approval of the Parliament would not be an obstacle to the conclusion of this agreement. And if this tribunal may please follow me to page 35 of the case files, I would like to address at this point. At page 35 on Respondents Exhibit R4, we have precisely an email from Ms. Blanchilli, which is claimant COO, sent to Mr. David Field, respondent COO. And at the first paragraph, Ms. Blanchilli says, and I quote, "We are glad to hear that the minister does not consider the cancellation of the parliamentary debate and the decision to be an obstacle of his approval of the agreement, and that the signing procedure can proceed as planned." End of the quote. Members
Sorry, I did not find the part that you are reading. It's on the.
It's on page 25.
Which paragraph?
The first paragraph. It starts with, "We are glad to hear that the minister," did you find it?
Yes.
Okay, may I proceed or you want me to read it again for you?
Yeah, but this is the words of the private party, okay, of respondents.
No, Mr. Arbitrator.
No, of
yes, this is
of claimant.
Yes, this is the CEO of claimant.
Yeah, but this does not amount to the validity of the consent as you were just stating. It's just words written by a private party. How can this amount to the validity of the arbitration clause, considering the Constitution of Equatoriana?
Yes, Mr. Arbitrator, the email from page 35 does not address the consent of the parties to use arbitration agreements. This word of Ms. Blanchilli addressed that the parliamentary approval would not be an obstacle to the present case. The consent of the parties to submit to arbitration is in fact present in page 22 of the case files. If this tribunal could please follow me to that page.
Before you go to that page, Counsel, can you just answer me the point that was put by your opponent, which is paragraph 6 of Ms. Horatia Porter's witness statement, which is your client's employee who has a legal qualification, who understood at all times that parliamentary approval was necessary. So whatever representations the minister may have made, how do you, what's your submission, what's your position on the fact that you always knew parliamentary approval was necessary?
Yes, Mr. Arbitrator, in fact, claimant always knew that the parliamentary approval was needed in the present case, but the minister has informed claimant that the approval would not be an obstacle and that they could have been subsequently granted, as it was stated by my opposing counsel and as present in.
But counsel, your clients are sophisticated commercial people. They would have understood that surely any one person cannot. Parliament is multi-party. It's not necessarily one party, one political party having a full monopoly. So there's always a risk, isn't there, of parliamentary approval not being obtained, no matter what a single minister may say?
No, I believe in this present case that the parliamentary acceptance in arbitration clauses would not be an obstacle to the present case, considering that to the bad reputation of Equatoriana's courts, all contracts concluded in the context of the NP development program were resolved by arbitration. So there is a precedent in Equatoriana that the contracts concluded under the NP development program were submitted to arbitration. And
where is that information, counsel?
This is precisely in the procedure order number 2.
Whereabouts?
46. No, it's on clarification number 34.
24.
34 on page 48.
Okay.
And I would like to quote that, what are the requirements for the parliamentary approval under the Equatoriana Constitution? That must be an express approval and a formal vote. The minister lacks any power to replace such an approval, but the approval may also be granted retroactively, as has been done in one extraordinary case so far. So
okay, but that's not to say that this is to do with the MP project. It just says it's been granted once retroactively, correct?
Yes, Mr. Arbitrator, but that's precisely what claimant submits in the present case, because the minister made claimant believe that the approval of the parliament could be subsequently granted, and that would not be an obstacle to the present case.
When did your client come to know that there had been one retroactive approval? Can you help us with that?
Yes,
did they come to know that before this claim had been brought or after the claim had been brought?
It was before, Mr. Arbitrator, because in the email of page 35 that I led this tribunal to, Ms. Belonchilli informed that the words of the minister was that the parliamentary approval would not be an obstacle, and therefore they knew that before signing of the contract, that the approval of the parliament could be subsequently granted. Concerning my second point, it must be addressed that this proceeding shall not be suspended or alternatively bifurcated, but in fact, continued.
Mr. Luis, I am still struggling with one quote that you said some 5 minutes ago. And you said that that's not an issue of capacity, but an issue of consent, and that the approval by the parliament was not so important. Could you please develop on this idea that the approval was not so important? I am still trying to manage this argument.
Yes, precisely, Mr. Arbitrator. The approval of the parliament is not so important as respondents tries to picture in this present proceedings, because in accordance with the law of Equatoriana, since Equatoriana is a signatory country of the New York Convention and to the UNCITRAL model law, Article 5 of the New York Convention and Article 7, Option 1 and 2 of the UNCITRAL model law offers that a valid arbitration clause must be exchanged by the parties and the record of the content of the agreement must be known. And therefore, since parties have vividly negotiated the arbitration clause present in the contract, and the arbitration clause was also ratified by respondent to the present case, there is an exchange of documents and the parties' previous intention to use arbitration in the present case.
So the fact that there is a legal provision on the Constitution of Equatoriana fixing standards for the validity of the arbitration clause has no importance in this regard because of the way that the contract was exchanged by the parties. Is this your argument?
No, Mr. Arbitrator, claimant does not submit that the approval of the Parliament must be ignored in this present proceedings. Claimant's submission is that the parliamentary approval is not so important as respondent comes to picture on the face to invalidate the arbitration clause vividly negotiated and concluded between the parties.
So what is the difference? So, but we're talking about no consent. We're talking about of lack of capacity, and I have the feeling that all of these matters, they lead to the non-validity of the arbitration clause. It's not enforceable against one of the parties. The arbitral award will not be enforceable. So I have the feeling that it's quite important. It's difficult to say that it's not so important. I'm still struggling with this idea.
Can I ask a question based on what my colleagues just stated? If you say that the lack of parliamentary consent does not invalidate the arbitration agreement, what do you say is the consequence of a lack of signature or approval? Is there any consequence, or there's no consequence at all?
Regarding the validity of the arbitration clause, you say?
Regarding the lack of parliamentary consent. If it does not invalidate the contract, what follows from the lack of parliamentary consent?
Well, Mr. Arbitrator, in the present case, we shall address under the unilateral principles, Article 1.7, which states that the silence must be addressed by the conduct of the parties. And in the present case, since the minister has informed claimant that the approval of the parliament was not an obstacle to the case, and that it could have been subsequently granted, the arbitration clause is valid to the present case.
So on your case, on your submission, there is no consequence at all for non-parliamentary approval?
No, Mr. Arbitrator.
Okay.
Considering the second submission, I just would like to ask for this tribunal for an additional minute to conclude submissions.
Any objection? No, please go ahead.
Thank you. Considering the second point, this proceeding shall not be suspended or bifurcated, but in fact continued. Respondent has stated at this present proceedings that this tribunal does not have the capacity to lead an investigation on corruption. However, it must be addressed that under Article 27 of the PCA rules, the Auto Tribunal has in fact the capacity to request the parties to produce evidence, and therefore there is a necessity in this present case for this tribunal to analyze the corruption sua sponte to the present situation, because respondent did not give to the present proceedings a bound proof or evidence that relates the issues of corruption to interfere in the jurisdiction of this Auto Tribunal.
Counsel, I know we're short on time, so I'm going to ask you one question, which is just to respond to your opponent's submission, which is that there is a real risk that will come with a different conclusion in our award, and therefore it'll be subject to set aside. What do you say about that?
Mr. Arbitrator, the answer to your question is twofold. First, there is no issue of enforcement of this award regarding the decision of this Auto Tribunal and the decision of the National Court of Equatoriana, since this tribunal addressed the civil aspects of corruption and the National Courts addressed the criminal issues regarding to the criminal liability of Mr. Field. And second,
just on that point, surely if we find that there is no corruption and therefore we award the claimant damages based on a contract, and then the national courts find that there is corruption, then surely no civil court in Equatoriana is going to enforce an award where they have found that there is res judicata in their own jurisdiction on a finding of corruption to a higher standard, surely.
Mr. Arbitrator, I would like to ask for an additional minute to answer your question.
I've asked you the question, so unless there's any objection, I'm minded to grant it.
No objections.
Okay, thank
you. Go
you.
ahead.
It must be addressed at the present case that the suspicion of corruption that respondent tries to rely its arguments in this present proceedings that were addressed by the investigative newspaper The Citizen only relate to national entities that are owned by family members of Mr. Field and close friends of the Socialist Party. And the agreement concluded between claimant and respondent is not under those investigations, and therefore the investigations under the national courts of Equatoriana does not affect the contract concluded between claimant and respondent and will not affect the award of the Sapto Tribunal. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, counsel. Your time is now up, so with an additional 2 minutes. So I'm going to hand over for rebuttal to the respondent, and you can have 2 minutes for rebuttal, given that I don't want to fall foul of equality of the parties.
Members of this tribunal, claimant relies on an email sent by its own COO in order to try to argue that the arbitration agreement did not require parliamentary approval. However, as claimant itself recognizes, there must be an express approval based on a formal vote. This, however, never occurred. This email mentioned by the opposing counsel members of this tribunal is not so important, but parliamentary approval certainly is. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. And over now to claimants for rebuttal.
Members of the Sapto Tribunal, claimant relies on the word of the Minister of Natural Resources and Development of Equatoriana, who is the chair of the supervisory board of the NP Development Program. If respondent is not bound to believe in the words of his own social public servants, how can we address that point? Claimant believed that the agreement was valid and that the approval of the parliament could be subsequently granted, and this proceeding shall not be affected by the issues of administration and organization in Equatoriana. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Okay, so any other questions from my colleagues?
No, not at this point.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
No questions.
Okay, thanks, Lucas. Okay, we'll move on to merits now. And I understand that the claimant shall be kicking off with merits. So over to you, counsel. I make it now 38 minutes past the hour.
Thank you,
Hello,
Mr.
everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Presiding Arbitrator. My name is Maria Clara Guimarães, and for the next minutes, I'll be addressing the merits of the issue on behalf of claimant, Drone I PLC, in this present proceeding. After tribunal, respondent defraud its own management and now attempts to avoid a contract that was vividly negotiated and concluded by itself. By taking this action, respondent left claimant no choice but to regard in this present arbitral proceeding in order to mitigate the damages that the non-selling of the drones will bring. And to clarify that, my speech will be divided in two main issues. First, that the purchase and supply agreement is governed by the CISG. And second, that respondent can rely on Article 3.2.5 of the International Commercial Contract Act of Equatoriana to not avoid a contract. Following to my...
Sorry, which article? Can you say it again? 3.2.5?
Of course, respondent cannot rely on Article 3.2.5 of the Act of Equatoriana. Following to my first issue, the contract is governed by the CISG for one main reason. The Castro I 2010 is under the scope of application of the convention. Article 2E of the convention states that the convention does not govern the rules of ships, vessels, hovercrafts, and aircrafts. However, at the drafting of the convention, the sale of UAS, unnamed aerial systems, and drones was not contemplated, and that exclusions of aircrafts must not be read into the exclusion of drones as well. The crucial factor for drones to be considered aircrafts in the sense of the doctrines of the convention is if they are designated for air transportation. According to Franco Ferrari, this is an important feature since... Sorry,
counsel, what's the authority that they must be destined for air transportation in the definition for the exclusion under Article 2E?
Mr. Arbitrator, it is Franco Ferrari.
Professor Franco Ferrari, he's the authority for the definition of Article 2E. Is that your submission?
Mr. Presiding Arbitrator, Professor Franco Ferrari is the authority to define that the factor for the drones to be considered under the CISG or not is if they are intended as a use of transportation. It is regardless subjective criterion.
Intended by whom, counsel?
By the party who is going to use the goods, Mr. Arbitrator.
Okay, and what if that intention changes over time? At what point in time do we take the intention?
Mr. Arbitrator, it is respondent's submission that we must analyze the intention that was demonstrated, and not only the simple intention, but its main intention. It is not respondent's submission that the Kestrel I 2010 does not have the capacity of carry cargo, for example, but it is claimant's submission that the main intended aim of the contract was for the surveillance purposes. And therefore, this means that according to the doctrine as Franco Ferrari and also commentators as Peter Schlestrin and Ingeborg Schavenzer, that we must analyze the intention of the parties, more specifically the party who will the goods, to rely on this characteristic.
So in this particular agreement, if we go to the agreement, let me find it. The agreement is at page 10, correct?
Yes, Mr. Presiding Arbitrator.
And there are a number of references in the goods here to the Kestrel I to aircraft, correct?
Yes, Mr. Arbitrator.
So should we not therefore conclude that it was the party's intentions that this was to be considered an aircraft, if that's the language of the contract?
Mr. Arbitrator, the discussion in this present case, it is if the Kestrel I 2010 is an aircraft in the sense of the convention or not. As a matter of fact, it is claimant's submission that an aircraft is any object that is capable of flying. But a drone, as a matter of fact, in the sense of the CISG, cannot be considered to be excluded from Article 2E, since this was not the intention to use the goods as a transportation matter. And
is it not intended to transport surveillance equipment?
Mr. Arbitrator, the surveillance equipment itself, according to claimant submission, cannot be considered detachable, cannot be considered a transportation, since it was not the intention of the Kestrel I to transport the surveillance equipment. The parties are going to
where is that in the documents, that it wasn't the intention to transport the surveillance equipment? Where's that evidence? Sorry.
Pardon me. And the end of the page in the contract in page 10, if the Zapto Tribunal could follow me, which was the page that Mr. Presiding Arbitrator was already there. In Article 2, at the end of the page, and if the Zapto Tribunal is with me, and I quote, the seller undertakes, letter A, to supply to the buyer 6 of its newest model of the Kestrel I 2010, out of which 4 are equipped with the state-of-the-art geological surveillance feature. So it is clear, members of the Zapto Tribunal, that the main purposes was for the surveillance feature. And of course, once again, it is not claimant's submission that the Kestrel I 2010 is not capable of carrying goods, but rather.
So is your submission that the word equipped does not mean carrying surveillance equipment?
Mr. Arbitrator, it is claimant's submission that the fact that the drone were main designated to be used for surveillance, that its intention is not regarding a transportation matter. And this is also demonstrated by the words of respondent and also by the engineer of the Kestrel I 2010 for itself. If the Zapto Tribunal could please follow me to page 45 of the record, which is on procedural order number 2.
Yeah, which question?
It is in the first line, Mr. Arbitrator. We're starting with the shape.
Yeah.
And if the Zapto Tribunal is with me, the shape and location of the payload base and the Kestrel I 2010, as well as its excellent but costly flexibility, are clearly engineered towards the use for surveillance purposes. End of the quote. In addition to that, the drones that are equipped with the surveillance technology does barely have any room left for carrying transportation. And in order to demonstrate even more the intention of respondent to fulfill only surveillance equipment.
Sorry.
Yes, Mr. Presiding
So where is the surveillance equipment held within the Kestrel? Is it within the payload base?
Yes, Mr. Arbitrator, it is within the payload base, the drone itself.
So, I mean, to me, on an ordinary reading of something being carried in a payload bay, it seems to me like it's being transported. You disagree with that? Can you explain why?
Mr. Arbitrator, claimant disagrees with that because, as a matter of fact, according to Ingeborg Schwenzer, in the past, the CISG has been found to be applicable to gliders, model planes, rockets, and space stations, as they are not designated for air transport.
And what was the date of Ms. Ingeborg Schwenzer's publication?
Mr. Arbitrator, this is on the commentary of the UN Convention on International Sale of Goods from 2018.
18. So how far advanced was unmanned vehicle technology at that time? I mean, is she commenting on this available technology? On the date of the contract, this was state of the art. On today's date of the hearing, this is no longer state of the art, says the respondent. So could Ms. Schwenzer or Dr. Schwenzer or Professor Schwenzer have foreseen that unmanned vehicles, when she was making her commentary, would be at this stage?
Mr. Presiding Arbitrator, at 2018, the drones were already invented. So it is claimant's submission that Madam Ingeborg Schwenzer could easily address to this point. And this actually leads me to my second submission, which is related to the fact that respondent cannot rely in Article 3.2.5 of the International Commercial Contract Act of Equatoriana to avoid a contract. In the disputed case, respondent aims at terminating the purchase and supply agreement by relying on the national law remedies of the law of Equatoriana. Specifically, respondent argues that it is entitled to avoid the agreement because claimant presented the Hawk-Eye 2020 in February 2021, and by that, respondent alleges that at the time of the conclusion of the contract, the drones were not the state-of-the-art anymore. Therefore, this issue will be divided in two main points. First, that respondent can only rely on the remedies provided by the CISG. And second, that even if the tribunal finds that the Act of Equatoriana is applicable, there is still no misrepresentation. As confirmed by respondent, the alleged misinformation concerns the features and quality of the drones. And since the CISG specifically addressed the matter of conformity, especially in Article 35, there is no gap in this question, and respondent can only rely on the remedies provided by the CISG. However, even if the arbitral tribunal finds that the law of Equatoriana is applicable and must be discussed in the present case.
Sorry, counsel, can you just, I know we're short on time, so can you just ask me one question? Why does misrepresentation does not fall within Article 4A of the CISG?
Yes, and a follow-up question actually to the presiding arbitrator's comment. I was just wondering from your speech, so what would be the difference between misrepresentation and nonconformity? How would that be dealt with this?
I will answer the questions in the order that was made. Firstly, Mr. Presiding Arbitrator, this is not a matter of Article 4A, since the CISG does not address a matter of validity. And this is, as a matter of fact, a matter of conformity, since respondent addressed that the problem, as a matter of fact, is related to the quality features of the Kestrel-I 2010 and the
Hang on. Sorry, under 3.2.5 of the ICCA, it states that an omission, there must be full and frank disclosure in negotiations. That's what it requires, right? And therefore, an omission from disclosure under the domestic law amounts to a misrepresentation. And the consequence of that would be that the contract would be void ab initio, which would be invalidity, no?
Mr. Arbitrator, we are here regarding the matter of fact of conformity. As it is stated by respondent itself, it is regarding the quality of the drones. And answering the question of Madam Arbitrator, the differences between a validity question and a conformity question is that if it is dealt with a conformity question, then it will be regarded the CISG, and the contract would be only avoided as a whole, as it is stated in Article 23 and 39 of the Convention, if it is a fundamental breach. While regarding the validity issues, it is going to be avoided if it is a matter of representation and if it is a matter of non-disclosure of facts, as it was stated by Mr. Presiding Arbitrator. And I see that—
Counsel, your time is up. I know that you were about to say that you could see your time was up.
Can I ask for an additional minutes to conclude my submissions?
Any objections?
No.
No, go ahead.
Members of the Zapture Tribunal, Article 3.2.5 allows the avoidance in case of non-disclosure of facts intentionally. However, members of the Zapture Tribunal, it is not reasonable to rely on a duty to inform a prototype. The Hawkeye 2020 was not ready, was an undergoing test phase, and also it is not reasonable to expect that claimant would rely in a product that wasn't even ready in a call for tender, which was a party who had deadlines to fulfill and could not rely on a product that wasn't at his services. And therefore, such disclosure of information is not in the present case, since claimant not intentionally misrepresented, or even in other words, the Hawkeye 2020, since it was not the state of the art at the moment of the contract, since it was not available. Therefore, claimant reinforced its submissions, stating that first, the purchase and supply agreement is governed by the CISG, and second, that the act of repertoriana cannot be used to avoid a contract. Thank you.
Thank you. Counsel for the respondent on merits. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Honorable members of this tribunal, opposing counsels, and everyone who is watching us. It is an honor to be here with you today, and as mentioned by my co-counsel, my name is Isadora Scotland, and today I'm honored to follow her in representing respondent in these arbitral proceedings. Members of this tribunal, I shall address the merits of this dispute by mirroring the order brought by my opposing counsel. But before I do, allow me to change and paint a different picture for this tribunal. Members of this tribunal, our client is a state-owned entity who opened a tender process specifically asking for 4 state-of-the-art aircraft. Respondent opened the tender process, claimant submitted its bid. Respondent chose it as the successful one, only to find out that the drones were not state-of-the-art, and now here claimant argue that they are not even aircraft. Members of this tribunal, the premises of this contract were established before it was even concluded. It is a sale of aircraft, and they should have been state-of-the-art. Claimant tries to distort—
Sorry, counsel, I'll start early on with you, but based on your submission, your opening statement there, do you agree that that whether or not the Kestrel was state-of-the-art, the time that we must consider is the time of the tender, because that's the only time that they would or would not have been selected?
Mr. Arbitrator, allow me to respectfully disagree. As respondent's counsel, we understand that the time is the contract, which is exactly when the parties have closed the deal. Well, it is a respondent's submission.
Just on that point, I understand from the papers that from conception to development and marketing takes approximately 3 years to develop one of these unmanned flight vehicles. And at the time of the tender, they were 1 year in. So surely at that time, they could not have known whether or not the Hawkeye would ever even come into production a year into development.
Mr. Arbitrator, allow me to switch the order brought by opposing counsel and then start with why Article 3.2.5 of the ACC is applicable and answer your question. Mr. Arbitrator, the issue of misrepresentation is one of not informing relevant facts and thus inducing a party to contract something that it wouldn't unless it was given this information.
Well, what's the relevant fact that you say was not informed to you, and when do you say it ought to have been informed to you?
Mr. Arbitrator, we understand that the relevant fact is the developing of and the subsequent launching of Hawkeye 2020, and the time that should have been released is any time between tender process, so March of 2020 and December of 2020.
And do you accept, counsel, that there is a right on the claimant to maintain confidential its trade secrets and any R&D information which is not released to the public?
Mr. Arbitrator, according to scholar Robert G. Bone, a trade secret owner could communicate secret information and still prevent its secrecy if the recipient promised to hold this information in confidence. What happens here, Mr. Arbitrator, is the respondent is not a competitor to claimant. It is simply a party who uses taxpayer money to buy goods. What it wanted was a state-owned good, a state-of-the-art, good. Thus, a good that was as best as it could and that would use taxpayer money in public assets the best way possible. What happened?
So just exploring that point, if I have something in development and I disclose it to you, a potential buyer, but I have no idea whether or not that will be successfully developed and ever go into production, how does that have any material impact on whether or not, if you want to buy something that's available, don't you?
Mr. Arbitrator, the issue here is not buying Hawkeye 2020 necessarily, but deciding not to buy Kestrel I 2010. What happens is that when you buy a good that you think is state-of-the-art, you certainly understand that you are paying for state-of-the-art. And then when 2 months later, a new drone, a new good comes into the market and makes your very expensive drone become outdated, then that is certainly fraudulent misrepresentation. What happens is that a respondent was looking for these goods that were specifically from the start set as state-of-the-art, and then was given goods which claimant always knew was developing from the beginning. And from the very short amount of time after contracting and actually being put into the market, claimant already knew of the possibility of the very subsequent launching and decided not to tell.
Excuse me,
So-
counsel, but
Sorry,
I'm
yeah.
sorry. Pardon.
No,
Yes,
go ahead.
Okay, so the Kestrel I 2010 it complies with all of the requirements established in the call for tender, right? Except for the state of the art.
Yes, not with the state-of-the-art, but with all of the subsequent.
Yes, and the state of the art argument, it refers to goods which are available presently, not in the future. I think even if the secret was shared between the parties, they have to be the ones that are available now in the present, correct?
Madam Arbitrator, allow me to respectfully disagree. It is understood that the technology in the present is the one that is the most important, not necessarily the goods in the market. So what we can see here is that claimant, always knew this technology was not only already been developed, but was to be subsequently put into the market, and that if respondent knew, then it could possibly it could contemplate the possibility of buying. But if it wasn't informed, then it would buy the goods, which opposing counsel has actually mentioned that claimant did not intentionally defraud respondent, but claimant failed to remind this tribunal that it had 3 drones which had come from a cancellation of another buyer, which is intent enough to try to give these drones away through Kestrel I 2010 and not disclose to respondent the possibility of a new drone coming up.
Sorry,
But there
Councillor,
will always be future goods which are better than current goods. So if you take Apple, for instance, we currently, I don't know, I think we have iPhone 13 or something. And like every year we expect to have iPhone 14 by the end of the year. And if you get iPhone 13 around August, it's going to be considerably cheaper than iPhone 14 in September. So you always know that you pay for the goods which are currently available and you pay a lesser price. So in that regard, also Hawkeye 2020 would be 100% more expensive than Kestrel Eye. And I don't understand how a product that complies with all of the requirements in the tender and which is considerably less expensive because it's not a recent product would compare to something that hasn't even been launched or sold yet.
Madam Arbitrator, allow me once again to respectfully disagree, because the drones and the aircraft that are presented here are very different from iPhones, for instance. In an iPhone, when you go to an Apple store and you go to an Apple site, you always know every year when it's going to be coming into the market. With drones, for instance, that is totally different. We don't know when drones or aircraft or planes, we never know in this industry when another one is coming to the market. As Presiding Arbitrator correctly asked me about, there have been a lot of time since claimant had been developing this good. Only claimant could have known when this would come into the market, of course, not respondent. What we can see here is that claimant always knew that they had better technology and that this technology was aircraft. Now,
sorry, Counsel, can I just ask you one question on that? Is there any evidence in the papers that had your client known about the Hawkeye, they would have purchased the Hawkeye and not the Kestrel Eye?
Mr. Arbitrator, I cannot point you into concrete evidence that my client would have bought Hawkeye, pardon me, but this is not a matter to be looked at. This is a matter of not buying Kestrel Eye.
Hang on. If the availability of the Hawkeye was never a realistic consideration to you, your client, then surely that's not a relevant factor for us to consider. And if it's your burden of proof to prove your positive case, then it's up to you to provide evidence to us that had Hawkeye been disclosed to your client, they would have purchased that in preference to the Kestrel Eye, no?
Mr. Arbitrator, allow me to respectfully disagree. The obligation under Article 3.2.5 of the International Commercial Contract Act is to disclose, and the lack of that disclosure is what should prevent the buyer from buying the goods, thus not necessarily from buying different goods. What happens here is that if the Hawkeye had been disclosed to respondent, then it should not have bought goods that with taxpayer money were going to be outdated in a matter of 2 months.
But that's my point. My point is, irrespective of whether or not they disclose, they may well be in breach of 3.2.5, but if that has no material influence on the outcome, if you would have always bought the Kestrel Eye, for example, because there wasn't a budget for the Hawkeye, then that's not relevant whether or not they've breached 3.2.5, is it?
Mr. Arbitrator, it is, because what I can see here is that claimant got the deal exactly because it didn't disclose this. Because it could buy from a respondent could have bought these drones from another seller, pardon me, or it could even have finished the tender process without buying any drones because
so on that submission, why did it succeed in its tender process if there were other better drones on the market, better than the Kestrel Eye?
Mr. Arbitrator, this contract was most likely tainted by corruption. So this is one of the possibilities of that. But even if we're not to consider corruption here, we can also see that only 3 bidders were put into the tender process, and we can see that Kestrel Eye complied apparently with the state-of-the-art requirement. If respondent had known that it was not state-of-the-art, then it would not have chosen it as the successful bidder. Members of this tribunal, allow me to now prove to you that Kestrel Eye 2010 are aircraft, and thus the tribunal should not consider the CISG applicable to the present purchase and supply agreement. Opposing counsel has argued that the will of the party who is going to use the drones is the one who makes the drones aircraft or not. Members of this tribunal, the party who is going to use the drones is respondent. Allow me to take you to page 33 of the records, and let me know when you're there.
Yeah, go ahead. This is the Citizen article of the 22nd of May, 2022.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Respondent exhibit number 2. On the second column, if you follow me to page, the third line, it says the drones were originally to be used exclusively for providing high resolution pictures. And then if you go 3 lines down where it says that purpose was, may I?
Yeah.
That purpose, however, was allegedly enlarged subsequently, given the very favorable offer. What we can see here, members of this tribunal, as well as within the contract text, was that the parties have always understood the aircraft as drones, as this
Sorry.
was, yes.
So you accept that the test is the intention of the parties? Do you? It's a subjective test?
Yes, Mr. Arbitrator?
Okay. And you say that the second sentence that you have read to us, the purpose was, however, allegedly enlarged. You say that that brings it into the aircraft definition?
Mr. Arbitrator, yes, because if we go further down, we can see that well, Mr. Arbitrator, I see my time is about to lapse. May I have the 2 additional minutes to answer your questions and then wrap up?
Any objection?
Nope.
2 minutes, counsel.
Thank you very much. Well, if we go into the quotations where it says a drone which would normally carry cameras or surveillance equipment in its cargo department should also be able to transport urgently needed spare parts or medicine to remote areas of the northern part development of Equatoriana. We can see here that it was responded who is the user of the drones, understanding from the beginning that it could use the drones not only for surveillance but carrying transportation, as opposing counsel has mentioned. So we can see this was also put into the language. And what should be taken into account by this arbitral tribunal is that respondent opened a tender process. In it,
But when is this timeline? Isn't the timing relevant?
Pardon me, Mr. Arbitrator?
If this change was post-contractual, then the contract was already entered into, and the purchase was for aircraft or non-aircraft. When do you say it's determined? Can I buy something which is not an aircraft, which subsequently becomes an aircraft?
Mr. Arbitrator, I understand, respondent understands it is not possible, but we can see that the parties had always understood this as aircraft. Allow me to take you to page 10 of the records to show you so. You correctly took the tribunal to this page, which is the contract in opposing counsel's argument. But what we can see from the 5th whereas, where it says, whereas in the process of negotiations, the scope of the agreement to be awarded was changed to reflect new developments and a possible additional use of the aircraft. So this was also reflected in the contract, which also mentions as the last word, aircraft. So members of this tribunal, respondent respectfully requests this tribunal to understand that as a sale of aircraft, the purchase and supply agreement cannot be governed by the CISG, and that claimant has defrauded respondent. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. I just have one last question, and that's the point that your opponent put to us about Article 2, in the same page of the contract, about Article 2A, that it's not goods because actually the Kestrel came equipped with the surveillance equipment. What do you say about that?
Mr. Arbitrator, I assume I have the time to answer?
Yes, you may have the time to answer.
Thank you. Mr. Arbitrator, we do not understand as respondent that the goods to carry would be surveillance equipment. Yes, of course, the drone can carry surveillance equipment, but as mentioned in the article we just read a few pages ago, that it can carry parts of equipment, it can carry medicine to different parts. So this is transportation. This is something that was reflected in the contract and that it was always respondent's intention with the contract. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, counsel. That just brings your 2 minutes up. So moving over to rebuttal, and the claimants may have 3 minutes if they so wish for their rebuttal.
Thank you, Mr. Presiding Arbitrator. Members of this arbitral tribunal, claimant indeed is not a competitor of respondent. As a matter of fact, respondent asked specifically for a state-of-the-art drone with communication link via radio. Members of the Arbitral Tribunal responded relies in a non-disclosure of a drone that even have the specific requirements for the itself, since the communication of the Hawkeye 2020 is via satellite, which was not the requested communication asked by respondent, and therefore there is no reasonable aspect in relying on a non-disclosure of the Hawkeye 2020. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Back to you, counsel, for the respondent for your rebuttal.
Members of this tribunal, opposing counsel and claimant get to very specific what ifs of this contention to rely on the fact that this could not have been a misrepresentation if the drone was not what it was presented. Of course, members of this tribunal, when a respondent asked for state-of-the-art, claimant knew better technology was out there. Claimant knew it had this better technology. It was just not willing to give it because, of course, it was willing to sell 3 drones that were outcome from another cancellation. Thank you.
Thank you to both counsel, to both sets of counsel. Any other questions from my colleagues?
No.
Nope.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. That brings proceedings to a close. I very much hope that the tribunal shall now be taken to another room and we shall deliberate and come back shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.
For those watching us through YouTube, we'll be right back with the decision as to the second place of the Rio Primos.
Congratulations, everyone.
Congratulations.
Parabéns.
Parabéns.
Parabéns, gente.
Good working painel.
Ai, e aí, vocês vão para CCBT, né? São vocês?
Cara, gente,
Vamos, tá?
E a gente vai right back, né? Ou não?
a
A
gente
gente
tá-
tá vivo? Acho que
Eu
sim,
acho que
né?
ele tá vivo. Oi, galera do YouTube.
Ah, então o quê?
While we wait, I'd just like to remember that this Wednesday, we'll have the UFRJ, the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro's team, facing a team coached by ChatGPT on a demonstration round in partnership with the CR Brazil branch and the arbitration channel. You will find the link to the video at the arbitration channel at YouTube. Before we announce the prevailing team, I pass the word to Joaquim Muniz to thank once again our sponsors and everyone involved.
Thank you. It was I would like to thank all the legal community of Rio de Janeiro to participate. We will have almost 40 teams on 3 days. We are in a quite innovative format. One day it was in person, and like especially thank Barbosa Musnic Aragão Advogados who hosted us and afterward gave a very nice cocktail with a wonderful view of the Christ the Redeemer. Whoever was there had an amazing day and a very nice evening. Yesterday, we spent the day doing those online hearings. Now have this face-off of two universities that were really impressive. So I'd like to thank all the university, all the coaches. You know how difficult it is to coach and to get this level of quality. You have to bear in mind that from the traditional Brazilian pre-moots, this was the first one to be done. They still have the Kansas CBC moot and the Curitiba moot, so get even better when you are there, and even better when you are in Vienna or Hong Kong. It wouldn't be possible without the arbitrators involved. More than 100 arbitrators on those 3 days. I thank them in the person of Federico, Lucas, and Luisa, spending a working day here, helping the students. And I would like to especially thank our sponsors. CPA, Curso Prático de Arbitragem, was the platinum sponsor. And I'd like to remember all of you that CPA is doing a very interesting course on disputes on corporate law. They are for free. And tomorrow at 7 p.m. Brazilian time, online on this YouTube channel, we're going to have the second class on corporate disputes in Brazil. I'd like to thank Barbosa Mesnick Aragão, Sérgio Bermudes Law Firm, Ferro Castro Neves Law Firm, Trent Rossi, Watanabe, for being sponsors of this event, and the Brazilian Bar Association, the Rio de Janeiro section. And last but not least at all, the organizing committee, represented here by Bernard, is not sleeping for 3 days to having this huge event set. Lucas Mendes has also Isabel Miranda, Daniel Greenbaum, Gabriel Carelli, Luisa, and a big group, José Marinho, a big group behind us. Having said that, I'd like to congratulate all the speakers and the teams. We are still counting because we're getting more sponsorships, but all of you are going to be all the speakers that got special prize, the 3 ones on the first date, the 5 ones on the second date, all the universities, including UFRJ, that won the 2 rounds, UFSC and Unip were vice champions on first day, and they're gonna get additional money whoever wins this round. So I pass the floor to the team to give the big news. But congratulations both teams. We were originally supposed to do a session again with FRJ against one of you, but your teams were so good that it's impossible for us to choose between you. So we passed the responsibility to Federico, Lucas, and Luisa. So now it's up to them to decide whoever performed the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Joaquin. Thank you, Bernard. So first of all, I want to say congratulations to both teams. Your performance was very impressive. As a coach myself, I understand, as Joaquin has already stated, this is quite early on in the process. This year in particular, firstly, we're back to in-person Viz Moot. And secondly, there's a very short gap between the respondent's memorial submission and the Viz trials themselves. So well done, very impressive quality. And we have had a deliberation. We have discussed our views and our conclusions in detail. It's been a tough decision. It has been very difficult. Both teams are very closely matched. However, there must be a winner. And on this particular occasion, we have found in favor of Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina. So congratulations to you. Congratulations to Unip. It's been a great performance by you two. And as I say, it was very, very close. So I sign off, leaving only to thank my co-arbitrators and to thank Bernard, Joaquin, and the team. And I hope that BMER have saved me one drink for when I'm in the marvelous city again in a few months. With that, I bid you all good evening.
Thank you, Frederico. And last word, UFRJ will have the easiest session on Wednesday, because after UFSC and Unip, I know that no artificial intelligence going to be as smart as those two teams, but it's going to be a groundbreaking event organized by the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, and all three arbitrators here from Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, and they were so kind to organize among all the teams in the world, a Brazilian team who was the one chosen to face off with artificial intelligence. So it's very, very interesting event. We have actors to play the part of the computer. So let's see how it will go on. And it's going to be at the Canal Arbitragem YouTube channel on Wednesday at 11 a.m. Brazilian time. So don't miss that. It's one of a time events, like when Kasparov played against the IBM computer. It's a game changer. And we're very glad that SEAB chose the winner of the Rio Pre-Moot. So good luck to all the teams. It's just the beginning of the journey, and you're already excelling. See you soon.
Thank you so much. Congratulations.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Congratulations to
Bye-bye.
both teams.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations.